There is probably no doubt that the term cinematic is heavily connected to aspiring young filmmakers these days. Some might consider it a trend originating mostly in YouTube tutorials and similar media, even though this might not be true if you look at what actually makes footage look cinematic. And I don't want to give you another color grading tutorial telling you how to put some teal and orange look on your footage and everything's fine, because there are a few key factors that are really important to make your videos actually look cinematic. And those are things you can do within almost every camera. A cinematic look often consists of footage played back in 24 frames per second, with a 180-degree shutter angle giving you a soft motion blur. And there's also a certain amount of dynamic range, making both bright and dark areas of the image easily visible. These three things, 24 frames per second playback, motion blur and dynamic range, are simply more compelling to our eyes than, for instance, 50 frames per second camcorder-like footage. And that is simply because it looks more natural. If you think about it, 24 frames per second is a frame rate that just feels realistic to our eyes, since it matches the image frequency of our brains. We also see motion blur in reality and have a good dynamic range, seeing both highlights and shadows easily together. So how can you now achieve this look with no matter what camera you're using? First, you simply need to put your camera in 24 frames per second recording mode. 25 frames per second also works if you want to shoot in PAL, but I personally would recommend switching to NTSC mode, because that equips you with some more common frame rate options like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second for super slow motion. When it comes to the shutter speed, the 180-degree rule simply says that your shutter speed should always be around double your frame rate. So for most consumer cameras, when shooting in 24 frames per second, that means a shutter speed of 50 or 1/50th is the closest you can get. If your shutter's too bright with the correct shutter speed, you need to put on ND filters to help you compensate for the light coming in. Keep in mind that if you increase your frame rate for slow motion footage to 60 frames per second, for instance, you also want to increase the shutter speed to 120 or 125 depending on the camera you're using. And don't forget to reinterpret your 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second footage to 24 frames per second before you start editing. But now let's talk about dynamic range. Simply said, you definitely want to shoot in a picture profile that gives you the most dynamic range. This can be a log picture profile as found on Sony cameras or more professional cinema cameras, or a profile that is often called cine-like or cine. And what most of these cine-like profiles do is they just pull out the contrast and saturation that is often already added in camera with normal picture profiles, and that way give you more flexibility in post when it comes to coloring your footage. I personally recommend not to mess with the internal settings of each picture profile, just select the one that works best for you and leave settings like contrast and saturation to default. But now let's recap. If you want your footage to look cinematic, make sure to shoot or playback your footage at 24 frames per second, set the shutter speed to around double your frame rate, and choose a picture profile giving you a good dynamic range. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to leave them down in the comments. I'm really happy to answer all of them. Hit that like button if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel to see more filmmaking related videos like this one, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.